Thank you so much for joining us. I'm completely, for those of you who know me, know that I'm absolutely outclassed and outgunned in this group, which will make it a little more of a challenge and a little more of a treat. So you've heard a little bit of the background about Common Core, and with Bob and Barbara and Chris's help, we're just going to flesh that out a little bit about what that means in Illinois, how we got here in Illinois, why this is the right thing or a good thing, but what some of the challenges are going to be. Because when you raise standards, there's a lot of support that the system, the teachers, the students, and the administrators who have to do the day-to-day work are going to need. So we want to talk a little bit about that, what that means here in Chicago, what that means for the state, and what all of us are going to need to do to be helpful, because I think there's a role all of us to play. So Chris, I'm going to start with you, if I would, as one of the people who was involved in the development of this. Can you just talk a little bit about how this is going to, how Illinois got to the point where we're doing this, and what you think some of the biggest changes are going to be that we're going to see in schools, in districts around the state as this goes forward?
Sure. Well, you're hearing me okay? As you heard, the Council for Chief State School Officers was one of the initiators of the Common Core. I was very involved and have been very involved in that organization, and believe that, as we were talking among states, there's a lot of efficiencies that can come from working together, particularly around something as basic as academic standards. A lot of our families and students now are going from state to state, and it's incredibly logical to have some cohesion among states. So that's where the initial discussion of this came from. It's going to be a big change in that we're now going to be assessing the application of learning. And folks who have been involved in things like career technical education have known for a long time. Students learn very well when they can apply knowledge and they see relevancy. These standards are going to drive us to that direction, which I think are extremely exciting, and require teachers to understand the standards students meet before they come to them and what they'll be needing afterwards, thus bringing a lot of cohesion into teaching and learning.
So I want to ask, Barbara, of you if I would, Chris, if you could share. You know, Chicago public schools there's been a lot going on in Chicago public schools, and I think people know that there have been efforts to try and consistently improve the rate at which kids are graduating and the amount of material we're mastering. I think most folks have probably read the new ISAT source came out, and we've got an awful lot of kids who aren't where they need to be, even while we're making progress. So if we haven't already been able to get kids where they need to be under the old standards, and if these standards are going to be that much more rigorous, tell us how much of a challenge it's going to be. What leads us to believe we're going to be successful at getting every kid where they really need to be with the Common Core if we've been struggling before?
Sure. So this is, for us at the Chicago Public Schools, an incredible culture shift. It's moving from a really prescriptive kind of what kids ought to regurgitate, what kids ought to put in their nuggets and not be able to figure out the application of that knowledge. And the culture shift also begins with how do we better prepare our teachers who are at the forefront of leading the quality change in teaching. So again, this whole culture shift is what we're dealing with, and I'll come to the crux of the question there, is we're moving from, people talk about alignment of the Common Core, and from my perspective, we can't do alignment. It really is saying there is a different way in which we need to better prepare and support our teachers to teach. And that becomes a district responsibility as we examine our system, which right now does not do that. I think that what you're seeing as a result of the past tests is the information world is so huge right now, we can't cram all of that stuff in a kid's heads and expect them to regurgitate it. What we will be doing and what we need to do is to provide the kind of systems that support our teachers, our parents, and our children to understand the applicability of what children are learning.
Plus there's less to master in each of the years, is there not? I mean, if you follow Bob, and those were really helpful charts that you've got, what you're doing is giving teachers and students permission to work on fewer things each year and therefore have more of an opportunity to master and go in depth.
Absolutely. The depth of the knowledge is key to what we need to do and prepare children. You talked about my grandchildren. I always use them as my case study. They start with numeracy, and it's the same concepts. It's less broad and much more deep, and that's what we want for every kid. I think our children in Chicago, though, I'm also very much cognizant of the necessary wraparound services and supports that are non-academic that our children need as well in order for them to be successful.
Let's talk a little bit. Chris, you mentioned the fact that one of the things that will happen as you move to new standards is that people want to know that you've then got assessments that are tailored to the standards that you're teaching, and that's been much discussed. In fact, generally when you switch to standards, and this may be lesser known among the some of you in the audience, that's actually the expensive part of moving to new standards. A big part of that is that you've got to develop whole new assessments. It's very expensive. We've got to tell us a little about what's happening and how a national consortium is helping with that, with common standards, how you can share that cost, but what you expect those assessments to look like going forward, when that's going to happen, and how we're going to get from here to there in a responsible way.
Sure. So Illinois is a governing state in the Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness, Career Readiness and Careers.
That would be PARC.
Yes, PARC.
I quizzed him on that yesterday, so we practiced up.
So there's another consortia, Smarter Balance. It sounds like a spread, but that's the other one. And we've been involved really in following the work of both. And here is a place where the federal government is investing money in the development of assessments to assess learning, which is very hard to do when you're assessing the application of knowledge. It's a different construct in assessment. So this will lead to a change when a student sits down from taking a multiple choice test to one which is going to be much more writing, demonstrating cognitive ability, understanding of critical thinking. And that's the kind of thing this will be assessing. And these will require the use of technology. All assessments are moving to online ventures. And this is important because it allows school districts to have information sooner when you take it online, and allows you to more quickly turn around results, to impact learning. We want to instruct students also through their education. So this isn't going to be a single time assessment, but one in which there is 2 assessment windows to determine a score. Thus you're getting a more valid read on what students know are able to do.
I'm afraid to ask the following question, but I feel honor bound to do so. And Barbara and Chris, I'm going to have you give a first answer, and then Bob, I'm going to ask you to give us a national perspective. Moving to online obviously does allow us to get real time. We've wanted that for a long time. And then once you've got that infrastructure, of course, there's a lot of other educational things you can do. But what's the cost to do that?
Yeah.
Barbara at the district level and Chris at the state level.
Sure. So there is a cost. Obviously, we don't have the infrastructure currently. We've assessed our school districts, and we're somewhat behind in this area. Many states have already been giving assessments online. We're just piloting that in Illinois. So we've assessed our school districts. Of the 60 that responded, 60% of them rather, about 25% would be ready now to implement an online assessment. So we do have work to do, from things even as simple as broadband connection to all areas of the state, all the way through connectivity within buildings, and then finally to devices. And the estimates just for getting this through, we had a capital request of $250 million last year to try to move this forward. And that's a rough estimate. We're still gathering data from our districts, but that doesn't take you all the way to the devices. That's just really on connectivity.
So there may be some investment decisions we're going to have to make.
Absolutely.
So you're glad there's some legislators in the room who now
Absolutely.
understand
I'm always
what
glad
some of
there's
that
legislators.
Hint, hint, wink, wink. So how does that look in Chicago, Barbara?
Yeah, it's a very serious and very desperate situation. The inequities across our district are visible, are apparent, and are glaring. The infrastructure that Chris spoke to is one that we have a challenge with, not only with the instruments, but then you also think of the training. Our children who don't have access to technology, or at least don't use the technology that they have for the purpose that we would like. That's a retraining of children, it's a retraining of teachers in order to be able to use the technology in the efficient way through teaching as well as preparation for the assessment. So it's a huge challenge. Many of our buildings are, we've taken a look at it and completed a survey, simply are too old for us and too costly, therefore, to get the kind of bandwidth we need. And so it's a huge challenge for our district.
How is this playing out? How have other states started to tackle this? Maybe that you can share with us all.
And some of the states have put in at the legislative level, they've put in the funds for the kind of movement towards a digital kind of infrastructure and backbone. The federal government is working on making available special bandwidth that goes back into the schools used only for education and lowering the price of that. When you look at the opportunities that come from this, one of the biggest things you read about is the digital divide, so the haves and the have-nots. So if you've got kids who come up in a system that doesn't give them access to computers, but at home, in my family we got iPods and stuff all over the place. The kids that don't have the access to that are further disadvantaged when they come out to get into the workforce. So the process of, we live in a digital world, deal with it. The second part, though, is that one of the biggest expenses states and districts have is their school book purchase. So as you go through and you look at, I know you've got a renewal process, you've got history, you've got math, you've got English, you've got all the grades. What you spend to refurbish or get the new curriculum, the new books, and how long you try to use them, it's a huge budgetary item. In the past, there were 4 or 5 states that determined fundamentally what textbooks were written. It's because they had big populations. You had California, Texas, and a handful of others. And everybody else, every other state had to pick from that. The way they're written by Macmillan, by a ton of other companies, is what all y'all want. So they put it in there. We lead the world in the thickness of textbooks. Our kids, it's a wonder they don't all have scoliosis when you look at their backpacks. A textbook for math is this thick. In Singapore math, textbook is less than half an inch thick, because it's made for that, not for 27 different states and 1,000 different districts. As the opportunity to have a common core emerges, business, nonprofits, and others are creating what's called open source or public commons curriculum material, meaning it's free. Free. No copyrights, no usage issues. So what will help the Chicago Public Schools is if they have the digital backbone, her textbook cost goes to zero. Zero. With enormous flexibility, because each of the teachers and classes and schools can determine that, well, I want to use this piece and this and couple it this way. It's a very, very effective way to do it, and that's the end game that a lot of states are looking at, and also some not-for-profit funders are looking to create more common source material.
So one of the things, and actually this has come up recently here in Illinois, even since we were organized to have this, and I would love, particularly Barbara and Chris, but you've got a national point of view, some people would say, look, there are going to be some costs associated with this. If we don't have that already figured out, should we just stop doing this until we've got the money lined up? What's the right answer to that? Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, my response would be absolutely not. I mean, we can't put the brakes on it. I think it's too important in terms of closing the divide between the haves and the have-nots. Those of you who've read the papers, there were some significant school consolidations in Chicago recently. And what we've done is to redirect those resources. So in those schools where we've consolidated, those children from grade 3 through 8 will have access to iPads and laptops, which allows us to download the material that we've been talking about. So it begins to move the process forward. I just would say that it's going to take us a little longer, given the enormity of our city and our district.
Chris, a state perspective on that?
Can't slow it down. So from a teaching and learning point of view, Barbara alluded to the preparation of teachers. I mean, we're also preparing teachers differently in light of the Common Core, because they should know this when they come out. We can't pay for professional development for folks afterwards. They should know when they're licensed how to do the job they're being asked to do. So that train's been moving now for 3 years. We've got school districts already moving ahead with implementation.
By the way, that was one of the questions from the audience, was what are we doing to prepare teachers for this work? And so
Right.
part of it is preparing next folks, is what I'm hearing you say, as well as the need for good professional development support. With that in mind, what are you hearing from the field? One of the other questions from the audience, and we hear this a lot, is, how are teachers in the field feeling about this? Have teachers been supportive of this? Have unions in general been supportive of the Chicago Teachers Union, Illinois Association, Illinois Federation of Teachers locally, and then what are we seeing nationally?
The teachers have been. The unions have endorsed this both at the national and state level because it makes a lot more sense. It's more logical with someone who's charged with providing instructions and not have to go a mile wide and an inch deep, but to be able to drill in and be able to apply. There's anxiety, apprehension always whenever you're coming out with new scores. The bar is raised, and how are those going to be used to evaluate me and whether I'm doing a good job or not, and that's all reasonable with this change. But it's absolutely something that teachers have embraced, that they like, and incidentally we involve teachers in this discussion. Even before the Common Core was an idea, we had high school teachers in the discipline of English, Language Arts, and Math sitting down with our faculty in those subjects, talking about what it meant to be college ready. That's why this is so important.
Barbara, what are you hearing from teachers in Chicago? And then I've got a wrap-up question about you.
Sure. Prior to my assuming the seat, our teachers had been intimately involved in discussion decisions around Common Core. And we continue that. I think one of the most beneficial conversations that we've been having with the CTU, in fact, is taking a look at teacher evaluation and assessment and really using that to determine very specifically how do we move in teacher support and professional development. And I would concur with Chris, as I talk quickly because I know the time, that as teachers are better prepared coming in, we want to attract, retain best, brightest, most skillful right here in Chicago.
So one of the things that I told you I wanted to ask, and somebody asked it, which I just love, whoever that was, is there an example of where this has gone really well? What we know is we've heard why this matters, we've heard what problems this may help solve, not sort of as a magic bullet, but as part of a series of things. But we also know that there are going to be real challenges. We also know there are going to be some costs and retraining, and we're all going to have to get behind it. Sounds like people are. But is there an example that we can sort of look for, hopefully, about where this has been done and that there's going to be good outcome at the other end of the tunnel?
Let me give you two examples, one of a nation and one of a state. Canada and the US were the only two of the top 34 OECD countries that did not have a national standard around education. Canada had provincial standards, and the United States had state standards. Canada hung out around number 18 or so for decades. About 10 years or so ago, they realized they were getting disadvantaged economically. I was going to say screwed, but disadvantaged economically. And so the provincial heads got together, the same way the governors and the chief state school officers here did, said, we got to fix this. So they all agreed on a common set of standards across Canada. Then they made a little bit different for some things in Quebec versus some things in PEI or something like that. They implemented it. Canada now is 5th in the world. That's over 10 years. It was hard for them, they did it, and they did it for their children. A state that took an early lead is Massachusetts. Massachusetts today has the highest performing, best educated students in America. Their kids perform, not at the top, but their kids perform significantly better than any other states. About in the 90s, they took on and they did comprehensive education reform. It went through multiple governors, it went through multiple years. They changed their standards, they put in higher standards, they changed their support for teachers and how they prepared. It took them years to do this. But if you look today, there are two ways to measure, multiple, but two common ways and data you can get to look at student performance across a state. One is the statewide testing. So it's the Illinois test that came out recently, where do our 8th graders perform on the subject and all that kind of stuff. The other is something called NAEP. NAEP is a National Assessment of Educational Performance. It's administered sampling-wise in 60 countries, the United States included. You cannot go any lower than a state level in the United States because the sampling sizes don't allow you to go to a school or a district. Massachusetts, on the NAEP scores, is the top in the United States. It is competitive. If it were a country, it would be about 8th in the world or so. Relative to its standards, students, what we call proficiency versus Massachusetts state standards, they, from a percentage-wise standpoint, fall about in the bottom 8 in the United States. That's because their standard is honest. Their standard is very close to the NAEP standard. If you look at most other states, their students are, Massachusetts students are like 54% proficient, something like that. And they're 56% on the Massachusetts state test. We'll pick a state. I won't name it, but a state not too far south from here. 85% of their students are proficient on their state test. On NAEP, they're 35%. Illinois is not unlike that either.
Well, actually, as it happens, we have now just, because of the changes that happened this year, you're actually seeing a much tighter correlation between those two things.
What happens is when you change the assessment and the test and you begin to measure against that, scores will drop. Doesn't mean your children get dumber, doesn't mean the teachers are doing worse. What it means is you're actually committing to a higher quality of education for children and you're being honest with them.
Please join me. I know we have not had enough time. I encourage you to mug them on the way out with any additional questions. They did not authorize me to permit you to do that, but I strongly encourage it. They're here at the front of the room. It's going to take them a while to get to the back. But please thank them for joining me on the panel here today.